Support comes from St. Louis Public Library Foundation, helping the library serve children and their families with programs and services needed to become lifelong readers. More information about the foundation is at slpl.org.
This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha. Homelessness doesn't just vanish because you don't see it, but it can feel that way. On the individual level, you can drive past someone asking for money at an intersection. When cold weather hits, the walls of your home and the warmth within can keep a person who's outside far from sight and mind, including what it's like to spend that cold night in a crowded shelter. But for schools, not seeing homeless students isn't supposed to be an option, and struggling to see them has long-lasting consequences. Federal law requires school districts to give students without permanent addresses access to the same education other children have. That encompasses the provision of things like transportation to and from school, as well as other services. In Missouri, more than 100 school districts have reported that they have no homeless students. And new reporting from the Midwest Newsroom, which has examined data about what we do know about homeless students in Missouri and 3 other states, points to districts undercounting students who are homeless. And that means thousands are not getting the school and education support they need. To dig deeper into that reporting, I'm joined by one of the reporters behind that new investigation, Kavahn Mansouri, investigative reporter for the NPR Midwest Newsroom. Kavahn, great to have you on the show again.
Good afternoon.
So your new investigation was released yesterday, and in it, you describe a, quote, hidden population of homeless students. What does it mean, first of all, to be a homeless student?
Yeah, being a student who's experiencing homelessness is very different from what you probably think of your typical, maybe somebody you pass, like as you said, on an intersection. These kids can come from many different backgrounds. Their home life can look very different. In fact, the vast majority of them are not people, kids who are living on the streets. They might be living at a friend's house or with their grandparents. And just really they might just not have permanent housing, or they must have a very unstable housing situation. Mm-hmm. It's a wider definition than most probably would think.
Yeah. And what are some of the situations that might lead a child to be homeless in the way that you've just described?
Yeah. As I said, it can be a situation where, for instance, maybe the parents are not in the picture and they're staying with their grandparents or at a friend's house. It can be your traditional living on the streets, emergency shelters, temporary shelter. It can even be if, a house is no longer safe to stay in for, maybe emergency, like literally like maybe the roof is falling in, or there also could be a situation where, like maybe there's abuse going on.
Right.
All that sort of filters in, and it's a very wide definition. HUD has a more strict definition for homeless people. When it comes to kids, it's much more broad.
Okay. So there are more than 32,000 homeless students in Missouri, and that's according to data from the U.S. Department of Education. You mentioned HUD. This is specific to Department of Education. So if, as the piece you've written, we're looking at a population that's hidden, how do you go about counting these youth?
Yeah, it's a difficult process, but basically, the difficulty here is several-fold. As I was doing a lot of the interviews for this story, it just kind of kept stacking up, all the things that are going kind of stacking up against these kids actually getting identified as homeless, as well as the people who are supposed to be doing it. So the students can be hard to find. Some parents are afraid to identify themselves as homeless because they don't know what's going to happen. Maybe the Department of Children, DFS, things like that. They're afraid they might lose their kids. They're afraid someone might call the cops.
Right.
Which McKinney-Vento laws actually would protect you from, and just general laws. But there's also, on the school side of things, especially in rural areas, these are low-funded, low-capacity school districts that have small staffs, and typically there are these individuals who are known as homeless liaisons. Every school district in the country has to have a homeless liaison, but that person might be doing several jobs. So on top of every other job they are going to be trying to, through interviews, through documentation, through observation, identify a student who's homeless. And again, it goes back to this really wide definition of what homelessness is. So if you don't have the training, which training can be very sparse because of this stuff, you might see a kid who's living with their friend and think, well, they're taken care of, so they're probably not homeless. But under McKinney-Vento laws, they technically should be getting assistance.
Right. So we are going to return to the homeless liaison point afterward, but this law that you've been mentioning, it is a federal law, and it's a major part of the investigation that was published yesterday, the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. So what is this law ostensibly doing? Like, what is it supposed to do?
Yeah, the law was passed in the 80s, and then renewed in 2015, I believe. And what it's supposed to do is ensure that students who are struggling with housing or experiencing homelessness get a equal education to that of their peers, which means it would provide them with immediate enrollment. Enrollment for homeless students is really hard because of a lack of documentation. So those kids should immediately be enrolled by their school, even while they're figuring out, if they're supposed to be there. It allows them to remain at their school of origin. So if it was the last school district they went when they had permanent housing, they should be there. Transportation to school, which is a huge part of McKinney-Vento, especially in these rural areas that we're talking about. We're not talking about maybe you live 10 minutes away from your school. You might live 45 minutes away from your school district. So if you don't have that transportation, you're not getting to school. And then there's a lot of other things. There's academic aid. The law requires for homeless liaisons, as we talked about, and just a lot of, but it also provides funding. And that's kind of the big crux of what we talk about in the story, is that the McKinney-Vento Act is supposed to be, it does give funds to departments of education in each state, and they're supposed to kind of interact with the school districts and then get that funding out to them. But that's a place where it struggles.
Right. And then you mentioned grants.
Yes. I mean, the grants are the funding, yes.
Right. And grants, that involves application, right?
Yeah. And this is where things get really difficult because, basically it puts the onus on the school district, who might not even know that they have homeless students, to apply for that grant funding.
Right. So your investigation, it takes up the McKinney-Vento Act as law, but it also examines it sort of through the lens of a map. You and your reporting partner, Daniel Wheaton, looked at hundreds of school districts in Missouri, Iowa, Kansas, and Nebraska, and they report that they haven't taken any of this federal funding. So can you just clarify what that means?
Right. So as I was saying, to get this funding, school districts have to step up and say, we need it. And we have homeless kids who need that funding. But the difficulty is the vast majority of these school districts, in rural areas, and really in most of our states, the majority of school districts are either saying they don't serve any homeless students, which through our analysis we believe is not likely to be true, but also that even when they do, they might be applying for it or getting rejected, or not even applying for it at all. So it's a really difficult situation, and and to be clear, I think we talked about this earlier, but it's not exactly the school district's fault. It's a really difficult capacity thing. I think as investigative reporters, we tend to look for malfeasance, a bad guy, someone to say this is the person who has done wrong. This is a really systematic issue from the top to the bottom. And I think everyone you talk to about this, everyone I talk to, kind of mirrors that everyone's heart's in the right place. But it is, I think one of the source I said, every arm of the octopus is struggling. They just can't. There's just a big failure going on, and it's really hard to put it on one particular person.
Right. And then that points to the system systemic sort of
Yeah.
aspect of this. Now, Missouri
Yeah.
has 511 school districts, and 111 of them say they don't have any homeless students. Why is it that that absence stood out to you?
Yeah, it's because, we took a look at our 4 states, and as we looked at this map of data that is collected by the federal government, I remember as my reporting partner on some former stars, Kate Grumke and I, she used to be the education reporter here, now is covering climate, but we were sitting there and we were looking at this map, and we were just seeing how many school districts were showing that they had 0 students. It visually really struck us, especially Missouri is more of a sort of weird sort of painting. But if you look at our other states, it was like clear as day. But it stuck out because as we started looking into this and comparing the data, it was very clear that in these areas, comparing that this reporting of 0 to federal census data, the specific data that looks into homelessness, as well as free and reduced lunch price program data in these areas, especially these rural areas, would show you that there are students who are living below poverty. There are students and families who identify themselves as homeless. And it would just that analysis that was done by our data reporter Daniel Wheaton showed pretty clearly that there's under identification going on. Yeah.
So, as far as the districts, and you've been very clear that you do not want to paint them as the villains or the ones to blame. But insofar as looking at all of these data sets and the plausibility of districts saying, we don't have homeless students, I mean, how can you show that there are? I mean, is it just a matter of looking at that data?
It's really tough, and that's why we're careful about this. We definitely say it's unlikely because we're looking at data sets as it's a broad stroke for a whole region, but it is experts on this matter would tell you that with this data set. It is very unlikely that these school districts, and in such a large portion, are really serving just no students who fall under this very broad category.
Right.
And then if you really get down to thinking about it, if you just think about who even living in an urban area, how many people who maybe when you were a kid were living on a friend's couch or living at their grandparents' house, maybe the parents were those all count. And it's tough because we know that school districts just really don't have the capacity to find these kids. And then there's a second layer that basically says the training's not there at all. So the schools who, again, everyone is heart's in the right place. There's even a lot of school districts that I've talked to said, we know we have students, but they're also they're taken care of, or there's not much we could do for them, or et cetera, et cetera. It kind of goes on. It's kind of this cycle almost.
Right. We need to take a quick break, but we will return shortly to continue this conversation. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio. Welcome back. Let's return to our conversation with Kavahn Mansouri. He's an investigative reporter with NPR's Midwest Newsroom and part of a reporting team behind a new investigation into how school districts in the Midwest are undercounting homeless students, which means thousands are not getting the support they need. So, Kavahn, let's return to Missouri. This is where we're sitting right now. And with the funding that has been received, Missouri has a tiny number of school districts that does receive this special funding, and that's just 1.9%. What did that say to you?
Yeah. I think the federal data we used was from the 2021-2022 school year, and I think it was 11 school districts got that funding. And it tells me that the money is spread razor thin. And that's what we heard from everyone we talked to, even the homeless education coordinator in Missouri. Says it's not a lot of money, $1.9 million for a lot of kiddos. And it's basically, again, a lot of school districts probably even want this money and are getting rejected for when they put their grants in. So it's to get back to your question, what it tells me is that the money is being spread about as thin as possible, and there's really just not that much more. For the entire country, it's roughly around $129 million spread out to, I think, more than in the country, more than 4,000 some odd school districts, if I'm remembering correctly. So you can do the math and think about how much money is going to each of these kids. There's other funding that goes into this as well, but again, it's not a lot.
Right.
We're talking about a few $100,000.
So Missouri's rate of participation in this government program was the worst of the 4 states you examined. There are other states like Colorado who are providing funds to about 40% of its districts. And again, Missouri is at just 1.9%. What are other states doing that Missouri is not?
It's really hard to say, and I will sort of add on that Missouri is the largest of our 4 states when it comes to this, in student population as well as school districts. So they have a lot more to cover, which can kind of make it, I would classify as all the schools in our 4 states as the school districts doing roughly around the same. But it's hard to say. We haven't gotten to that point of asking, what is Colorado doing that our states aren't? But if you look around, you can see that there are other states that are struggling the same. I think Michigan we looked at was roughly similar. A few other states, and then there are some states that you wouldn't really expect that again are up at that 40% value. So it's really tough to say. I think it's something that we're going to continue to report on and look into. But yeah, I will say the Midwest, from what I could tell, was holding some of the lowest percent participation throughout the country.
And to clarify, those 4 states that you took that deep dive into are Missouri, Iowa, Kansas, and Nebraska.
That's right.
Yeah. So earlier we had talked about the services. What they're supposed to get under McKinney-Vento are things like transportation to and from school. There's academic support as well. What else is this funding, which we've already said is not a whole lot? What else is this funding supposed to cover?
Yeah, it's supposed to, as you said, transportation, academic aid, things like that. That's what goes directly to students. But the funding is also to provide for actual schools to, for instance, pay for identification, pay for training, pay for perhaps a team to identify these. Some school districts have like whole teams that work on this, and those are the schools that are going to see more grant participation and more identification. And that's kind of what that money goes to. But the vast majority from what we found went to transportation. But as much as the grant funding goes, it's and again it's a competitive process too. That's one thing that I think is very much worth noting in this whole thing. So the school districts who maybe are putting applications, they might be getting rejected because their application wasn't as good as perhaps a better funded school.
As good. That's an interesting way to put it.
Right.
Kavahn, near the beginning of your piece, you quote Barbara Duffield, and she's the executive director of a nonprofit that advocates for homeless education. She said, "You don't see the students, so you don't think they're there. Then you don't set aside enough funding to have the capacity to go out and find the students." And she talks about this challenge as being, quote, almost circular. What does that mean, Kavahn?
It's a cycle. It's a really difficult cycle. These schools are struggling to know and see their homeless population. So when it comes time, whether it's on a 3-year period or a 1-year period, to apply for grant funding under McKinney-Vento or even Title I, which is another form of funding, they might not apply. They might apply and get rejected because maybe their identification isn't strong enough or they don't have enough students. They may not put enough Title I funds aside. And then what does that lead to? It leads to not having the money to go out and find these kids, not having the capacity to know that they even exist. I'm sure we'll talk more about homeless liaisons, but the vast majority of them at smaller districts are holding they're juggling a lot.
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a cycle. And everyone I talked to said that it's this very, very frustrating, really sad situation because, I think everyone knows that these school districts even know that these kids exist in some cases, but there's not much they can do for them.
Right.
I had one person I talked to very early in the investigation said, well, these rural school districts, they know these kids are out there. But they also believe the community might take care of them. So it's a mixed bag. It's really difficult.
So that's a great segue to the homeless liaisons.
Yeah.
And your reporting raises a really important question, and that is that if schools are obligated to support their homeless students and funding is available, are so few districts just even applying for it because they don't have the capacity, not because they don't have the will?
Yeah. I think I talked to Nebraska's homeless education coordinator, and she was telling me that she knew of a assistant superintendent who was the homeless liaison for the school district. So that person is in charge of identifying kids through documentation, observation, just basically knowing, getting trained on that stuff. All the things that come with homeless liaison, and then actually applying for the grants as well. So think about that for a minute. If you are the superintendent of a school, you are managing an entire school. He was also, this coordinator telling me, mopping the floors, working the lunch line, driving a bus, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's one person who has all the responsibilities of a superintendent, assistant superintendent, doing all that, and then on top of it is in charge of applying for grants. Meanwhile, in better funded schools, I don't want to say well funded, but better funded schools or schools that have really made it a priority to identify their kids, that one assistant superintendent, it could even be like, in some cases like the gym teacher, they have to get a grant in that is competitive versus a school that might have a team of 3 or 4 people working on a single grant. So I think we can all see how that's going to end. I'm sure there's situations where the Department of Education, Secondary Education, Missouri are going to choose that grant, but it is competitive in nature, and it does pit schools kind of against each other when they're trying to get funding for kids who are homeless.
Right.
A ride to school, some clothes maybe. So it's really difficult. It's difficult, and like I said earlier, it's a cycle of there's not enough funding, so schools have to kind of compete against each other for it. There's one person who's working as the liaison for the school. They've got 100 other responsibilities. So who's being left behind? The kid.
Something that you'd mentioned a couple times has to do with the schools sort of leaving it to the community.
Yeah.
Like someone else will help them. If people know that this child or those children are homeless, what role though does something like stigma play in the challenge of identifying homeless students? Yeah,
I mean, a lot of the sources I talk to basically point at this is that these rural communities of homeless, especially kids, are not going to look like what the typical perception of homelessness or experiencing homelessness is. We're not talking about driving under 44 at Hampton and seeing people under a bridge.
Yeah, yeah.
We're talking about kids who are, living with their friends because their parents are maybe struggling. Kids who are living in shelters. I mean, there's not many shelters in rural areas, so that's, not always the case. But also kids, I had one one member of the National Center for Homeless Education who remembered a family that was living under a barn, in the basement of a barn, because that's where they could find to live.
Right, right.
So these are not, this is not a visible population. I think the word hidden population was repeated to me maybe 5 or 6 times by different sources.
Sure. So as you've said, homeless students don't exist only in certain areas. Urban, suburban, rural areas all have homeless students or students who are experiencing homelessness. So the rural challenges, is there anything that we've not talked about that people should be thinking a little bit more about when it comes to homeless students in rural parts of our region, of our state?
Yeah. One thing I want to say, I know we're talking about rural, but this is not just a rural issue. I think the reason we focus on it is because our 4-state region is very rural. But this problem is just as prevalent in St. Louis City, in Omaha, Nebraska. It just looks very different. And I think that's what kind of drew us to the rural part of the story. If a student is experiencing homelessness, their life is going to be incredibly difficult. They're losing out on a place that feels like a home away from home. I think everyone can remember school as being a place where it may not have been the best experience of your life going to school, K through 12, but it was a place that you at least you got a meal. You got, it was a warm place to be. And when kids don't get that, when they don't have that transportation or that enrollment to get into school, they're losing out on that bastion. So think about, again, if you're living out in, I don't want to throw out a random place in Missouri, but if you're living in rural Missouri and your school's 30 minutes away and, there's not a bus that comes to you, and you're living in a precarious situation, you're not getting to school. That's gone. That situation is difficult, like just going to be out. And really, I think anybody who knows about homeless education, who's an expert, will tell you that, getting that education that they're missing out on is their best way to break the cycle of homelessness and get out of that cycle. Because with an education, they have a better shot. But if they stick with if the system is failing them, then it's very likely that they will just continue to that cycle will repeat.
So looking at systems is something that you have done before. And back in November, you were on the show, Kavahn, and with then STLPR reporter Kate Grumke, talking about an investigation that you did looking at Hazelwood School District, and that's in North St. Louis County. And for that investigation, you delved into the way that district sought to kick out students who could not prove their residency within the district. Are there connections that you drew from that case to the one we're talking about now, as far as, undercounting homeless students and what those students are not getting?
Absolutely. Our Hazelwood investigation opened the door to this investigation. As we looked into Hazelwood, we saw a systematic problem at a school district, and it sort of made us think, what else is going on out there? And this situation is very similar, and it kind of speaks to what I was just saying, that like this problem exists in urban environments as well. In Hazelwood, what really stuck out to us throughout that investigation is that a lot of the kids that we were identifying through documentation, through interviews, et cetera, were kids who were most likely McKinney-Vento eligible. So we got this giant trove. I remember because Halloween's coming up. It was the evening of Halloween evening. My wife and I just got finished giving out candy to some kiddos, and I got this big document, 1,000-page document of emails sent by parents. And one that really stuck out to me, and I think stuck out to a lot of our staff and people in this newsroom, was this one where these grandparents were sending photos, desperately trying to prove to the Hazelwood School District that their kid lived in the school district, and that even though a member of their team of investigators had gone through his things at their grandparents' house, they were still saying, you can't go to school here. And that is a situation where it was a pretty aggressive, like, we're kicking you out of school.
Right.
The only difference here is that, in the rural areas, these kids are just kind of going missing, or like, not being counted. Or maybe they are going to school, but they're not getting the services that they're required. Mm-hmm. In Hazelwood, it's kind of interesting, and I think this is still an ongoing problem in Hazelwood, as far as I know, is that these kids, a lot of these kids probably are McKinney-Vento eligible. A lot of the documents we read through, there were arguments of McKinney-Vento within it. Mm-hmm. So it's a big question about, the McKinney-Vento Act ensures that kids who lack documentation get enrolled immediately. Mm-hmm. Is that happening in the Hazelwood School District? Mm-hmm. I mean, that's an unanswered question from that investigation, because it doesn't seem that way, at least from what we could tell. It was a lot of kids were basically being asked for very intensive documentation and not getting that, and not being able to provide that, and therefore missing out on weeks, maybe sometimes months of school. And then sometimes and I'm sorry to get on a little tangent here, but sometimes providing all the documents and still being told no. There was one mother I talked to who, she was afraid to come forward because of, she was desperately trying to get her kids into school. And at a certain point, she was just basically told, you failed our, your appeal, so you can no longer go to this school district. It's a really difficult situation.
Yeah.
And I think Hazelwood's kind of what got us onto it, but it was a little bit of an extreme example. Mm-hmm. But it's the same sort of thing.
Right. And lastly, this is the first piece in a larger investigative series. What are you hoping to learn as you continue?
Yeah, our next stop will be in Nebraska, where we're looking at two school districts who are trying to make it work with a lack of McKinney-Vento aid and just general aid, and what they're doing to try to give support to these families. And one thing that if you read this investigation, you're probably saying, where are the people? Is that the rest of the series is going to highlight those stories. We're hoping to give our listeners and readers, an inside look at what it's like to go through this process and to be a McKinney-Vento student or not be a McKinney-Vento student, to receive that aid or not, and what that looks like. Mm-hmm. So that's what we're hoping to sort of present and to sort of show that, like, what's lost when these kids are missed by their school districts. And I would say, I don't want to say the school district, because I mean, they're missed by their school district. Their school district isn't counting them, but it's really the system that is failing these students. There's not enough money. We know that there's not enough identification, and it's that cycle I talked about. It just keeps kind of going and going, and in the meantime, we have these stories that we're finding throughout the Midwest, and I promise you elsewhere, that are just. That are pretty depressing, frankly. Mm-hmm.
But it will be great to hear and read some of those stories of personal experience.
Yeah.
Kavahn Mansouri is investigative reporter for the Midwest Newsroom, which is a collaboration of NPR affiliates in Iowa, Kansas, Missouri, and Nebraska. You can read his piece, A Hidden Population of Homeless Students in the Midwest Isn't Getting School Services, at our website. That's stlpr.org. Kavahn, thank you again for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
This episode was produced by Danny Wissentowski.
Audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
The Gateway brings you the day's news each weekday from around the St. Louis region and the state capitals in Jefferson City.
Our schools are accredited. We don't need this bill.
And Springfield.
How many more years must pass before lawmakers see time is of the essence?
I'm Abby Larico. Join me each weekday for The Gateway on the STLPR app or wherever you get podcasts.